Hi, I'm Clara, and today's story will take you on a journey of betrayal and sweet revenge. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine that December, the kind of smell that should have softened everything, but it didn't. It only made the coldness in my chest stand out more. My father had remarried 2 years earlier. My stepmother, Evelyn, arrived with a smile that never reached her eyes and a taste for control. She wore designer scarves even when she was doing dishes, and she had a way of making generosity look like a performance. To the neighbors, she was kind. To me, she was a constant, quiet underminer. She corrected my table manners at family dinners, rearranged my childhood photos on the mantel, and called my job temporary in front of guests. Small things at first. Little cuts that sting more because they come from someone who should be family. That Christmas was supposed to be different. My father had been sick earlier in the year. He'd recovered, but the hospital bills had left him tired and quieter. He'd promised me a small inheritance, not because I needed it, but because he wanted to make sure I had something of my own. He told me, in a voice that trembled with relief and stubborn pride, that he'd put an envelope with instructions in a safe. "It's for you," he said, tapping the leather-bound box like it was a secret. "Open it when you're ready." I pictured the envelope for weeks. I picture my father's handwriting, the weight of his words. I pictured a small, private justice, a note that said, "You matter," or a modest sum that would let me move forward. I didn't tell Evelyn. I didn't need to. This was between me and my dad. On Christmas morning, the house was bright, the tree a riot of lights. My father moved slowly, but he was there, smiling in a way that made my throat ache. Evelyn moved like a conductor, orchestrating the day. She handed out gifts with a practiced flourish and a comment for each one. When she reached me, she paused, and I felt the room tilt. She handed me a thin, white envelope. It was light. Her smile was too wide. "We thought you'd like a little something," she said, and the words were syrupy. I opened it with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. Inside was a single blank card. No note. No check. Nothing. The card was folded, empty as a promise. "Is that it?" I asked because my voice sounded small in the living room. Evelyn laughed, a sound that cut. "Oh, Clara, don't be dramatic. It's the thought that counts." She set the envelope down like a verdict. "Your father and I decided you don't need anything else. You'll be fine." My father's face went slack for a second, like a man who'd been punched by a memory. He looked at Evelyn, then at me, and his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. I wanted to reach for him, to ask, but the moment passed. He smiled weakly and said, "Merry Christmas," as if that could fix the hollow. I remember the physical sensation. My hands went numb, a buzzing that started in my fingertips and spread up my arms. My heart thudded like a trapped bird. I felt the room tilt and the air thicken. People laughed around me, but their voices were distant, as if I were underwater. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the card across the room. Instead, I folded it back into the envelope and put it in my pocket because I couldn't let them see me break. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat on the edge of my childhood bed and stared at the blank card. I replayed the morning. Evelyn's smile, the way she'd said, "You'll be fine," the way my father had looked away. The injustice wasn't just the empty envelope. It was the message behind it, that I was expendable, that my father's promise could be erased by someone with a louder voice and a prettier scarf. I thought about all the times I'd been dismissed, at work, at family gatherings, and relationships. I thought about the small humiliations that pile up until they become a mountain. The anger that rose inside me wasn't the hot, immediate kind. It was slow, a pressure that built like water behind a dam. It made my hands shake. It made me lie awake and plan. The turning point came 3 days later. I was in the kitchen, making tea, when I overheard Evelyn on the phone in the living room. Her voice was low, smug. "Yes, I handled it," she said. He was so gullible. I told him it was better for everyone if she didn't get anything. He agreed. "Honestly, Clara doesn't need money. She's always been so dramatic." She laughed, and the sound was a blade. I felt something inside me snap. Not a scream. Not a collapse. A quiet, cold clarity. The dam didn't burst, it shifted. I realized then that this wasn't just about an envelope. It was about being erased, about someone else deciding my worth. I thought of my father's safe, the leather box he'd tapped. I thought of the promise he'd made. If he'd put something in that safe for me, then someone had lied. Someone had taken my thing and turned it into a performance. I didn't tell my father what I'd heard. He was fragile, and I couldn't bear to see him hurt again. Instead, I started watching. I watched Evelyn's routines, the way she locked drawers, the way she kept the house like a stage. I watched my father, who retreated into quiet corners and smiled at old photographs. I watched myself, and I began to plan. The days after that phone call felt like walking through a house of mirrors. Everything familiar was distorted. Evelyn's kindnesses became performances. Her compliments were barbs. She began to tighten her control in small ways. She moved my favorite mug to the back of the cupboard. She misplaced my winter coat. She made offhand comments about my job that left me second-guessing myself for hours. Each slight was a pinprick. Each pinprick added to the pressure behind the dam. I started keeping a notebook. Not a dramatic one, just a small spiral I carried in my bag. I wrote down times, phrases, the way Evelyn locked the study door at night. I noted when my father took his pills, when he left the house, when the house was empty. I watched the safe. It sat on a shelf in the study, a leather-bound box with a brass lock. My father had always been private about it. He'd said, "It's nothing important," but his fingers lingered on it like a promise. The more I watched, the more I noticed patterns. Evelyn liked to host late-night calls with friends. She left the house for long walks on Sundays. She kept a small key on a chain that she never took off. She had a habit of leaving drawers slightly ajar when she was in a hurry. These were small things, but they were the kind of small things that add up into opportunity. I also started to gather evidence. Not to blackmail, but to make sure I wasn't acting on a rumor or a hurt feeling. I found receipts that didn't match what Evelyn claimed she'd bought. I found a bank statement that showed a transfer from my father's account to a joint account with Evelyn, a transfer that happened the week before Christmas. I photocopied the pages and slipped them into my notebook. Each page felt like a small, cold victory. There was a moral line I refused to cross. I wasn't going to humiliate my father or drag him into a fight. He deserved better than that. My plan had to be precise, surgical. I wanted the truth to be undeniable and the payoff to be clean. I wanted Evelyn to be exposed in a way that didn't destroy the family, but that made her cruelty visible. The turning point in my planning came when I found the envelope. It wasn't in the safe. The safe was locked, and my father kept the key on a chain around his neck. But one afternoon, while Evelyn was out and my father was napping, I opened a drawer in the study to look for a pen and found a thin, white envelope tucked behind a stack of old bills. My heart stopped. The envelope had my name on it in my father's handwriting. I didn't open it. I held it like a relic. The paper smelled faintly of his cologne. My hands trembled. I could have taken it and run. I could have confronted Evelyn. Instead, I did something quieter. I photographed the envelope, the handwriting, the way the paper had been folded. I slipped it back where I'd found it and closed the drawer. I needed more than a photograph. I needed a plan that would make the envelope speak. I started to map out the timeline. If Evelyn had convinced my father to sign something over, there would be paperwork. If she'd moved money, there would be transfers. If she'd hidden the envelope, she'd left traces. I made a list of places to check. The study drawers, the safe, the filing cabinet, the bank statements. I made a list of people who might know. The family lawyer, the bank manager, my father's old friend who handled his investments. I also rehearsed my emotions. Revenge stories can go sideways when anger takes over. I practiced calm. I practiced the face I would wear when I confronted Evelyn, steady, unhurried, like someone who knows the end of the story. I practiced the voice I would use with my father. Gentle, protective. I wanted to be the person who fixed things, not the person who burned everything down. The plan took shape slowly, like a machine assembled in the dark. First, I needed proof that the envelope was meant for me and that Evelyn had interfered. Second, I needed a way to make that proof public without turning it into a spectacle. Third, I needed to ensure my father's dignity remained intact. I started with the lawyer. I called the family attorney under the pretense of asking about a routine question, a will, a small estate matter. He was polite and distracted, but when I mentioned my father's name and the safe, his tone changed. "He's been in touch," he said. "He mentioned leaving something for you. He asked me to hold off until he was sure." That was the confirmation I needed. The lawyer's voice was a small, solid thing in the middle of my storm. Next, I visited the bank. I asked for copies of recent transfers. The teller was sympathetic and efficient. The bank records showed a transfer the week before Christmas. A large sum moved from my father's account to a joint account with Evelyn. The transfer was authorized with a signature that matched my father's, but the memo line read, "Household expenses." The timing was damning. I photocopied the records and added them to my notebook. Each page was a small, cold proof that Evelyn had been rewriting the story. She hadn't just given me an empty envelope. She'd taken what was mine and turned it into a performance. The injustice was no longer abstract. It had numbers, dates, and signatures. But I still needed the envelope itself. The photograph wasn't enough. I needed the physical proof to confront her in a way that would leave no room for denial. I waited for the right moment. I watched Evelyn's routines like a hawk. I learned when she left the house, when she took long baths, when she fell asleep on the couch with the TV on. I learned the rhythm of her life. The night I took the envelope, the house was quiet. My father had gone to bed early. Evelyn had fallen asleep in front of the television, a blanket over her knees. I moved like a shadow. I opened the study drawer, found the envelope, and slipped it into my bag. My hands were steady. My heart was a drum in my throat, but the drumbeat felt like purpose, not panic. I didn't run. I walked to my car and sat for a long time, the envelope heavy in my lap. I thought about what I would say, how I would say it. I thought about the moment when the dam would finally break and the water would rush through. I thought about my father's face when he realized he'd been lied to. I thought about Evelyn's face when the performance ended. I drove to a small cafe and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a note in my father's handwriting that read, "For Clara, something to help you start." Tucked beneath the note was a check. The amount was more than I expected. It was enough to change my life in small, practical ways. A deposit on an apartment, a course I'd wanted to take, a buffer that meant I could breathe. I sat there with the paper in my hands and felt a complicated mix of relief and fury. Relief, because the promise had been real. Fury, because someone had tried to erase it. The plan was no longer about proving Evelyn wrong. It was about making sure she couldn't do this to anyone else. I called the lawyer from the cafe and told him I had found the envelope. He listened, then said, "Bring it to me. We'll handle this carefully." His voice was steady, and for the first time in weeks I felt like I had an ally. But I didn't hand it over immediately. I wanted the moment to land in a way that would be clean and undeniable. I wanted Evelyn to be exposed in front of the people who mattered. My father, the lawyer, and the family who'd been fooled by her performance. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done without the chaos of a shouting match. So I waited. I planned the reveal like a scene in a play, with timing and lighting and a single, unavoidable truth. The day I chose for the reveal was ordinary on the surface, a Sunday, the kind of day when people let their guard down. Evelyn had invited a few neighbors over for tea, a casual, performative gathering where she could display her warmth and control. My father was in the garden, pruning the roses he loved. The house hummed with the small noises of domestic life. The kettle, the clink of china, the low murmur of conversation. I dressed simply, the way I always do when I want to be invisible. I carried my notebook and the envelope like a talisman. I told myself to breathe. I told myself that this was not about spectacle. It was about truth. When the guests arrived, Evelyn moved through the room like a queen. She introduced me with a practiced smile. "This is Clara, my stepdaughter." The words were casual, but the tone was acclaim. I sat quietly, listening to the conversation, letting the room fill with the sound of normalcy. I watched Evelyn's hands as she poured tea, the way she smoothed her skirt, the way she glanced at my father with a possessive look. At the right moment, when the conversation lulled and everyone's attention softened, I stood. The room turned toward me like a tide. I felt the eyes like a pressure. I held the envelope up, the paper catching the light. "I found this," I said, and my voice was steady. Evelyn's smile faltered. "What is that?" she asked, the question small and sharp. "It's an envelope with my name on it," I said. It was tucked away in the study. I walked to the center of the room and opened it. I read the note aloud, my voice calm, the words landing like stones. "For Clara, something to help you start." I let the silence stretch. Then I pulled out the check and the photocopies of the bank transfers and the lawyer's note confirming my father had intended to leave something for me. The room shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The neighbors' faces went from polite interest to something like shock. Evelyn's face drained of color. She reached for the check as if to snatch it back, but I held it out like evidence. "This was meant for me," I said. It was hidden. There was a transfer from my father's account to a joint account with Evelyn the week before Christmas. "I have the records." Evelyn's mouth opened and closed. "You're making a scene," she said, but the words were thin. My father came inside, drawn by the sudden hush. He looked at the papers in my hands, then at Evelyn, then at me. For a moment, he looked like a man waking from a dream. "Is this true?" he asked, voice small. Evelyn's eyes darted. She tried to smile, to deflect. "It's complicated," she said. "We thought it was best for everyone." My father's hands trembled as he took the documents. He read the note, the check, the bank statements. His face moved through 1,000 expressions, confusion, hurt, then a slow, dawning anger that was quieter but more terrible than anything I'd seen. He looked at Evelyn and said, "Why would you do this?" Evelyn's defenses crumbled in a way that was almost pitiful. She started to speak, to explain, to accuse me of theft, of misunderstanding. But the lawyer arrived then. I'd called him earlier and told him to come by if anything happened. He stepped into the room with a calm that felt like a gavel. He confirmed the transfers, the signatures, and the fact that my father had indeed intended the envelope for me. He explained, in plain language, that moving funds without full disclosure could be considered undue influence. Evelyn's face went from pale to furious. She accused me of orchestrating a trap. She accused my father of being forgetful. She accused the lawyer of being biased. Her voice rose, but it sounded small in the room. The neighbors shifted uncomfortably. The performance she'd built for months, the warmth, the control, the perfect hostess, began to unravel in real time. The satisfying part of revenge is not always the humiliation. Sometimes it's the quiet, undeniable exposure of truth. Evelyn tried to salvage dignity, but dignity is hard to fake when the facts are stacked against you. She left the room in a flurry, muttering about privacy and betrayal. Later, I learned she'd called a friend and tried to spin the story, but the seed had been planted. My father sat down heavily in his favorite chair. He looked at me with eyes that were both ashamed and proud. "I'm so sorry," he said, and the words were small but honest. He reached for my hand, and for the first time in months, I felt the warmth of him without the shadow of Evelyn between us. The aftermath was messy in the way real life is messy. There were conversations with lawyers, with bank managers, with family friends. Evelyn tried to fight, but the evidence was clear. The bank reversed the transfer pending investigation. The lawyer advised my father to change account access and to make his intentions explicit in writing. My father, who had been passive for months, found a steadiness I hadn't seen in him since before the illness. He apologized to me in a way that was both private and profound. Evelyn moved out a few weeks later. She packed her scarves and her carefully curated life and left with a face that tried to be defiant but was hollow. The neighbors whispered for a while, then life resumed its ordinary rhythms. My father and I rebuilt the small rituals that had been interrupted. Sunday walks, tea in the garden, quiet evenings with old photographs. The envelope had been a hinge that swung the house back toward something honest. For me, the revenge wasn't about money. The check helped. It gave me breathing room and options, but the real victory was the restoration of truth and dignity. Evelyn had tried to erase me with a blank card and a smile. I had found the thing she hid and used it to make the truth visible. The payoff was not a dramatic public shaming. It was the quiet, steady reclaiming of my life. I won't pretend I felt nothing for Evelyn. There was a small, private satisfaction when she realized she couldn't rewrite the story. There was relief when my father's eyes cleared and he could see her for who she was. But there was also a sadness, the knowledge that people can be cruel and that trust can be fragile. In the weeks after, I used the money to move into a small apartment of my own. I took a course I'd wanted, and I started to build a life that wasn't defined by other people's opinions. I learned to set boundaries, to speak up earlier, to keep my own records. I learned that revenge, when it's earned and measured, can be a tool for justice rather than destruction. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's a quiet, careful unmasking that lets truth breathe again. If someone tries to erase you, keep your evidence, keep your dignity, and let the truth do the work. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed? Subscribe for more stories like this. I'm Clara. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.